program is brought to you by realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. With more properties for sale than anywhere else, we make it easier.
Thanks for being with us here on Business Now. Let's take a look at what happened at the home auction markets around the country over the weekend. And what we can see is across Australia, there were 1,331 auctions. The clearance rate, though, an incredibly low 50.7%, certainly low by historical standards. In Sydney, there were 460 auctions. The clearance rate here, 47.6%, plus another 1,159 private auctions. In Melbourne, there were 420 auctions. The clearance rate, 58.3%, you can see here, plus an extra 981 private sales were made. In Brisbane, 92 auctions. The clearance rate, just 38%. Think about that. An extra 999 properties were sold privately. In Adelaide, 45 auctions. The clearance rate here is stronger, 75.6%, but a smaller base, of course. An extra 300 properties sold privately. In Canberra, 66 auctions. The clearance rate, 65%, plus an extra 80 private sales. Let's bring in here Angus Moore, economist with the REA Group. Angus, does that tell us anything about the trajectory of prices, do you think?
I think it tells us two things. One, it's winter. Things are colder, both in temperature and in the conditions. But it does, I think, also point to the broader slowdown we're seeing in conditions. So it's taking longer to sell homes, measures of buyer demand have come off, clearance rates are down. All of that points to the fact that the RBA is raising interest rates as quickly as they are.
Yes. Cooling
buyer sentiment, and yes, we're likely to see prices decline as a result.
Okay, but my observation is a bit like retail, sales are holding up more than what people anticipated. The fall in home prices is nowhere near yet where some of our big banks are suggesting between 20 and 30% price falls from peak to trough.
Yeah, we certainly haven't seen much in the way of price falls thus far. Indeed, in Brisbane, we only saw the first fall last month and it was 0.1%. Prices in Adelaide are still growing in June. We'd probably start to see more falls as we get through this year and as the RBA continues to ramp up interest rates. The impact of rates probably hasn't been felt by everyone yet, but it certainly will by the end of the year.
Yeah, and certainly with suggestions of 0.5% rate rises from here until Christmas by some, that's going to have an impact. But then there's an extra part about this. It's always about supply and demand. And so if you don't sell half of the properties that were on the market this week, they've either got to come off the market or maybe at some point the owners of those properties have got to accept a lower price if they're to clear.
Exactly right. And, we're starting to see that prices are coming down, clearance rates are falling. As you pointed out to start the segment, we've certainly seen very low clearance rates in recent weeks. Be interesting to see once we get into spring, when things start to pick back up, whether we start to see a bit more activity, a bit more buyers active in the market. We're starting to see more investors coming back into the market, which is a bit of a change from the past 2 years. The past 2 years has really been about first home buyers and them being very active. So it'd be interesting to see how that dynamic changes as we get back into the typically busier spring
And of course,
period.
investors are always looking for a bargain as well. So that might be one of these things. I know that you previously had experience with the Reserve Bank. One thing I did want to ask you, to what extent does the Reserve Bank take, shall I say, knowledge and information from these housing markets?
Yeah, housing is obviously critical to the Australian household sector. It's most people's largest asset. It's an incredibly important source of wealth. One of the channels that monetary policy works through, and a thing that the RBA will be watching very closely, is what housing prices, and in this case falling housing prices, means for people's consumption. How will they pull back on their spending? How much will they pull back, both due to having to pay more on their mortgage and the fact that they're just less wealthy than they were 6 months ago.
And because that also goes into consumption, and they want to see what aggregate demand is going to end up being like, because that will determine, again, they're setting for interest rates long term.
Yeah, exactly right. Consumption, thinking things like everything from cafes to holidays to your groceries, that flows through to jobs, wages, inflation.
Angus, always good to have you in the program. We'll speak to you again very, very shortly.